All right, one more structural feature to step back and notice. So far what we have is an argument for a free market in, in employment and an argument against a free market in employment. This argument against a free market in employment then also turns into an argument for a minimum wage, and we also have an argument against a minimum wage. So we really have four positions that have been articulated here: for and against a minimum wage, and for against a free market in labor. Notice one interesting feature about each of those. This side is making the position that if we have a free market in employment, we will end up with mutually beneficial, that is to say, win-win transactions, right? That the free market tends to win-win. So there's that assertion, but that is immediately counterposed by this position here that says if we have a free market in employment, that works out as a win-lose transaction. So one thing to think about further is it the case that these guys or these guys have a better argument about how free markets work? Are free markets essentially win-win, or are free markets essentially win-lose? We have the parallel argument with respect to the minimum wage. This position argues that a minimum wage is lose-win. Sure, employers take a hit, but employees gain, and so we have a lose-win transaction. This argument against a minimum wage terminates in the conclusion saying that no, a minimum wage actually is lose-lose. And that's interesting structurally, right, and one sign of a thoroughness of an analysis, and it's something to look for when you're doing your own case studies. When you look at both sides of the argument, do you get all of the possibilities articulated? And so we have win-win, win-lose, lose-win, and lose-lose. And that exhausts the logical possibilities. All right, next step of the argument is to notice that when we have made an argument against the minimum wage, this argument is only about economic issues. So what it's talking about is how employers and employees, buyers and sellers react to changing market conditions. But it hasn't said anything about the ethics or the politics, right, of minimum wage. And so that means our analysis is incomplete. We'll notice up here in the argument for the minimum wage, there were claims made about ethics, there were claims made about economics and business, and there were claims that were made about the proper function of government. So a complete case on the other side, or a complete response to that argument, is also going to have to touch on all of those bases. So let's just then say that what we have so far is the economic argument against minimum wage, right over here, but there's a question about the ethics of the minimum wage and the politics, right, of the minimum wage. And let me start with the politics. There was a survey that was done a generation ago, published in the American Economic Review, in which professional economists, right, were asked, what do you think about the economics of minimum wage? There's this controversy over whether minimum wages increase unemployment or not. And one of the shocking things, at least shocking to me when I read it, was that 90% of professional economists essentially agreed with this analysis here. They agreed with the assertion that an increase in the minimum wage leads to higher unemployment among workers. And that was shocking to me, because when did 90% of economists agree on anything? So this is, from the perspective of the economics profession, not very controversial at all. But there raises a question, right, in my mind. If it's the case that professional economists who study the issue are almost unanimously opposed to minimum wages, why do we still have minimum wages? And why is it the case that minimum wages are extraordinarily popular? At any time that there's a piece of legislation to increase the minimum wage, it passes by a huge majority. And of course, the answer is that minimum wage legislation is not driven by economic reasoning, rather it is driven by politics. And so we have to ask about why politicians, right, who are the ones who pass and increase minimum wages, why they are so strongly in favor of economics. Now, what we then have to say is that we do live in a largely democratic society, and politicians are not always responsive to the electorate in a way that we think they might should be, but the minimum wage is one of those issues that politicians almost always do what they judge the electorate to be in favor of. So if we look at it from the perspective of a politician, What I have to look at is if it's an election year or I know that an election is coming up and the minimum wage issue is on the table in some respect, I survey the people who will be voting for me and voting against me, finding out what issues matter to them and what they believe on those particular issues. So if I'm a politician and I'm thinking about the minimum wage, I am going to look out and say the vast majority of people who are young, who are inexperienced, right, who are poorer, what do they think about the minimum wage? And pretty obviously, the vast majority of those people think that a minimum wage is a good idea, that it benefits them. There also are going to be a large number of people in the middle class who are not affected, at least not directly, by minimum wages one way or the other. But when the minimum wage issue is put to them, what they think is, oh, it sounds like a nice idea. It's going to give poorer people, younger people a step up the economic ladder. Isn't that a nice thing? And so I will be in favor of it. And so any politician then knows that if he or she takes a position against the minimum wage, they are then immediately going to alienate a huge number of the voters. But then at the same time, if one is a professional politician, you can't be up to speed on every single issue that you have to vote on. So you'll have professional boards and professional advisors to give you information and analyses and recommendations about what positions, right, you should take. And so on economic issues, almost every professional politician has economic advisors. And if the survey results are accurate, what that means is that anytime the minimum wage comes up, 90% of the time the economic advisors are saying minimum wage, bad idea, don't vote for it, perhaps vote to repeal the minimum wage. So that puts the politician in a bind. Politicians can, of course, follow flowcharts like this, and they can study the economic impacts, right, of various things. And so they can probably reach an agreement with the economists that yes, in the medium to long term, a minimum wage really is a bad economic policy. But then at the same time, they know that the electorate wants them to pass the minimum wage or to increase the minimum wage. And so they have to make a choice. Are they going to go with what the economists are saying, or are they going to go with what most voters say? And pretty clearly then most politicians are going to go with what the voters say, even if they don't necessarily think it's good economic politics. So what we have then is what I will call one issue here, and that will be the issue of economic education in a democracy. And one of the core political issues in our current situation is the vast gulf, the vast divide in opinion about legislation involving minimum wages, with professional economists on one side of the divide and the electorate, or most of the electorate, on the other side of the divide. Now, one other issue that's a politics issue that directly bears upon ethics issues, and this would be the position, and I'll put it up on the ethics side of the equation here, which is to say that the minimum wage is not only bad economics, right, from this side of the argument, that it maybe is not simply dysfunctional democratic politics in action, but the minimum wage is, in fact, an immoral, right, policy. And that's a fairly strong piece of language to be putting out there. But let me give you the argument that's made here. There was a Supreme Court decision in the earlier part of the 20th century that involved a minimum wage. It involved some people who were working for very low wages, almost volunteering at a hospital. And the Board of Labor at that point had gone in and said, you people are working below the minimum wage. We want the hospital to increase your wages. And they had resisted. But the argument that they had made was that we have a right to set the price for our own labor. Right? If we want to volunteer to work for the hospital, well, that means that we're essentially working for zero. Right? You might not think, politicians or Board of Labor people, that we should be offering our labor for zero. You might want us to be earning more money than that, but it's our decision. It's our responsibility to decide what our labor is going to be worth. And the same thing would then hold if I'm working for 5 cents an hour or 50 cents an hour or $5 an hour. The price of labor is something that should be my responsibility and my freedom to choose. So the argument here was turning it to say that rather than seeing employees as potential victims, right, who need protection from rapacious employers, this position was saying, well, by treating employees that way, you might think you're protecting them, but you're also taking freedoms and responsibilities away from them, and anything that undermines the freedoms and responsibilities of adult people is an immoral action. Let me give you an example. It's a near personal anecdote. A couple of years ago, there was a young man in my neighborhood who just graduated from high school. The following year, he was off to university. And as with most young people, he didn't have enough money, so he wanted to get a summer job. Jobs, as it turns out, were hard to come by for people of his age. But he did end up with 2 offers. One of the job offers involved going to work in a convenience store at the next town over from our neighborhood. And the job was a third shift or a night shift, working in a bad part of town in a convenience store. But he would be making minimum wage, right, if he did so. So he has to commute about 15 minutes, including all the transportation costs there. He has to work night shift, and he has to work in a bad part of town. But he is making minimum wage, and that would be a legal job for him to take. The other job offer he had was from a slightly older friend of his who was already in university and somewhat entrepreneurial. And what that young man had done was gone to all of the neighborhoods over the course of the late winter and early spring, and got contracts with homeowners to mow their lawns right for the summer. He just said, you know, we will mow your lawn once a week or a certain frequency, and here's how much we'll charge. And so he had a whole series of contracts for homeowners in my neighborhood and my neighbor kid's neighborhood as well. And the offer that he made to the neighbor kid was, he said, well, I will set you up with a lawnmower, and your job over the course of the summer will be to mow these 20 or 30 lawns in your neighborhood on a certain schedule. And the kicker was, though, that the amount that was being offered, if you crunched all of the numbers, worked out to less than the minimum wage. Now here's the question. Which job should the young man take, right? And that's to use the ethics language, the should language, right? Or which job is best for the young man? That's also to use moral language, evaluative, normative language as well. And if the answer that comes to your mind is to say, well, it really shouldn't be my responsibility, right? Or it shouldn't be my judgment call to decide for this young man. He's an adult. He should make the decision about which position is best for him. Maybe he wants to take the job working in the convenience store. Maybe he wants to mow lawns outside in his own neighborhood during the day during the summer. I should not have any power to forbid or mandate that he takes either of those positions. Right, but the point of minimum wage legislation is to do exactly that, because then what we have is politicians saying, you, young men, may not take this job. That's an illegal job, and if you take that job, we will come after you, right, with the full power of government. We will fine the person who offered you the job, or we might even throw that person in jail, right, for violating various practices, and we will forbid you from taking a job that you might, in your own independent judgment, think is best. So this then is to say that the minimum wage then is overriding people's self-responsibility. I'll just abbreviate that as SR, and it's also overriding their freedom, right, to make choices as they see fit. Now, we might feel sorry for people who are younger and inexperienced, right, and poorer. We might want to have them get a leg up the economic ladder, and there are any number of ways that we should be able to voluntarily, right, help them. So re-emphasizing this, right, as an ethical principle. But the most important thing always is to say, well, if you find yourself in this situation, it's your responsibility. Maybe you have to start off taking some very low-paying, grimy jobs that you otherwise might not occur, but you'll get a little bit older, you'll get a little bit more experience, you'll be less poor, so the next time a job opportunity comes around, you'll have more bargaining power, you'll be able to work your way up the economic ladder. All right, so let's draw a line here. What we then have is a three-way debate, right, over the minimum wage position. This position arguing essentially for an egoist account of ethics, a laissez-faire, right, account of a limited government account of politics, and an economics that emphasizes the unintended consequences of minimum wages and the benefits of free markets. On the other side of the debate, we have a position that is critical, right, of free markets, arguing ethically that employers are motivated and empowered to act as predators, and that we need to have a more enforced altruistic solution that sacrifices employers to some extent to benefit the employees, and a more expansive interventionist and paternalist account of government action. So that's the minimum wage argument, arguments against the minimum wage, arguments for the minimum wage, and then debates over the alternative to a minimum wage, which is a free market solution, arguments for and against there.